Welcome to the Civil War. We will fight the war in two parts, then take two more to put the Union back together, to close out the Union. Today we'll look at the formation of the Confederacy, the first shots of the war at Fort Sumter, the first battle down the road at Manassas, and the technology that would make this the most deadly war in American history. Lincoln was elected president in November 1860. By the time he took office, 7 southern states had seceded from the United States. Upon coming into office, Lincoln claimed that the Union was perpetual. It was never-ending. His message to Southerners was that the United States government would not abolish slavery where it already existed. Remember, as a candidate, Lincoln wanted to stop the spread of slavery, not end the institution. Lincoln argued that secession was illegal, the Constitution did not give states the right to leave whenever they chose, and that he would do whatever it took to preserve the Union. It is very important to understand that at this point, Lincoln's motivation for going to war was to preserve the Union, and slavery doesn't enter into the equation yet. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 convinced Southerners that they had lost their political voice. And as I had said before, South Carolina was the first state to secede on December 20th, 1860. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated in March 1861, the remainder of the Deep South, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, had also seceded. And on February 4th, 1861, the South formed its own government, the Confederate States of America, with its capital at Montgomery, Alabama. Jefferson Davis, a plantation owner from Mississippi who served as a member of the House of Representatives, was an officer in the Mexican War, a U.S. Senator, and Secretary of War, was selected as the first and only president of the Confederacy. Notice the seal of the Confederacy. George Washington on horseback indicates that if Washington was alive in 1861, he would support the Southern cause. Of course, there's no way to prove this, but considering that the creation of an independent United States was Washington's life's work, some might make an argument against this claim. The point, Washington adds legitimacy. Just like when they invited him to preside over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, his presence made the work they wanted to accomplish legitimate. Speaking of constitutions, the Confederacy created their own constitution that was similar in very many ways to the United States. But it did promote many of the ideas that had driven the country apart in the 1850s. It made protective tariffs illegal, slavery and the transport of slaves were legal, and states were supreme to the federal government. This last part would cause many issues for the South during the war. While the South was seceding and forming a separate government, then-President James Buchanan, who's the only president from the state of Pennsylvania, did nothing, arguing it was both illegal for the South to secede and for the federal government to do anything about it. So we have a 4-month window between Lincoln's election in November 1860 and his inauguration on March 4th, 1861. The inauguration of the president will be moved from March 4th to January 20th in 1933 through the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. After the South seceded, there were 2 forts within the boundaries of the Confederacy that were still controlled by the United States government, one in Pensacola, Florida, the other near Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Sumter was located in Charleston Harbor and was running out of provisions. Lincoln's choice: reinforce the fort and face armed conflict with South Carolina, or surrender the fort and give the Confederacy an air of legitimacy and appear to be weak. Lincoln told South Carolina that he was only providing food for hungry men and not reinforcements or supplies. South Carolina took Lincoln's action as an act of aggression and opened fire on Fort Sumter in April 1861, and the fort surrendered 36 hours later. The significance of Fort Sumter was far-reaching. It was the opening shots of the Civil War. It also made the South the aggressor as they were the ones who attacked. It led Lincoln to call for 75,000 more troops. When the president made this request, the Upper South seceded as they did not want to fight against the South. So, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee were now members of the Confederacy. In Virginia, the western counties, where anti-slavery sentiment was high, separated from Virginia, and in 1863, the United States added West Virginia to the Union. Border states were those states that allowed slavery but did not secede. Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland were important for the North, especially Maryland because of its proximity to Washington, D.C. let's take a minute to review some of the ideas and events that got the United States into the war before we start the fighting. Sectional differences over tariffs, the expansion of slavery, and states' rights was a major cause as it highlighted the differences between North and South. And slavery is at the center, as we see two different views highlighted by Southern slave owners and Northern abolitionists. Other causes, the Dred Scott decision, which allowed for the spread of slavery into territories, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which highlighted the horrors of slavery for many in the North and in Europe, and the failed compromises over slavery, Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and even the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Also, the presidents during the 1850s did nothing to inspire unity. Millard Fillmore took over after the death of Zachary Taylor in 1850. But very little comes to mind when the name Millard Fillmore comes up, except maybe who? And the aforementioned James Buchanan allowed the South to secede and form their own government without a response. And lastly, Lincoln's call for federal troops after Fort Sumter. All 7 of these causes drove the two sides apart and into a deadly war that would last 4 years. The map provides us with the lay of the land when we go to war in 1861. The Union states there in red. The Deep South, those states in blue, were the ones that seceded after the election of Lincoln. You see the gray states there, the Upper South. Those are the 4 states that seceded after Lincoln called for troops following Fort Sumter. And the blue states are those 4 border states. These are states where there was slavery, but they did not secede. Another thing to consider is why they even fought in the first place. The North argued that secession was illegal and that the Union must be held together, by force if necessary. Lincoln laid out this argument when he came into office. I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the union of states is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments. A note on the flag there, that's the 34-star U.S. flag, which became the flag after Kansas entered the Union in January 1861. Every time the United States adds a state, they have to add a star. And some of them are interesting, as we don't always have the nice symmetry we have today with 50-star flag. The South argued that the North was attempting to deny their property rights. Of course, slavery is at the center of their argument, but also they believed that the federal government was an agreement between the states and that states could basically come and go as they please. They believed that the government had taken too much power, like in the debate over nullification. The flag you see there is the first national flag of the Confederacy. As men went off to war in 1861, each side had their own advantages, but the North seemed to have the edge. There were 22 million people in the North and only 9 million in the South. Of the 9 million Southerners, about a third of them were slaves, and slaves were never permitted to fight in the Confederate Army during the war. The North had superior transportation networks, with over 70% of the American railroads. The South produced less than 10% of the manufactured goods. This would be a major disadvantage for the Confederacy during the Civil War. And as the war starts, both sides believe it will be a short and glorious war. This is a mistake people make when any war breaks out. The North has more manpower, more manufactured goods, more diverse foodstuffs, better transportation, and a centralized government with a good wartime leader in Abraham Lincoln. The South had the cotton industry that they would hope to use to gain an ally in Great Britain, superior military leaders, people like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, and others, and the motivation of defending their homeland, as the war will be fought almost exclusively in the South. The North would have to wage an offensive war because they needed to defeat the South in order to get them back into the Union. The South was on the defensive, seeking to survive. And the first battle between the North and South was waged in Manassas. Northerners named the battles after bodies of water or natural features, and Southerners named them after the nearest town or man-made landmark. So for Northerners, the first battle of the Civil War was the first battle of Bull Run, and for Southerners, it was the first battle of Manassas. At a battle that was marked by a lack of organization by both armies, Thomas J. Jackson stood out. As one observer said, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall," and Stonewall Jackson was born. The Union was forced to hastily retreat and was defeated. But the Confederate victory showed that the war would not end quickly and would be costly. There were nearly 5,000 casualties at Manassas that day. Lincoln then called for 500,000 more troops who would serve for 3 years. For the North, the first phase of the Civil War was marked by many defeats and a lack of effective leadership from its generals. They found a general in 1862 at Forts Henry and Donelson when Union forces were able to capture Confederate forts at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. These were strategic spots on the Tennessee and Cumberland River. The South's lack of railroads made river transportation significant, so the victories here was a major blow for the South and started the meteoric rise of Ulysses S. Grant to the U.S. Army. At Shiloh in April 1862, Union forces were pushed back by Confederates before Grant rallied his troops and forced the Confederates to retreat. The fighting at Shiloh in southwest Tennessee was the most ferocious of the war, with more than 24,000 casualties in 2 days between the two armies. Casualties include killed in action, wounded, and captured or missing. Generals saw the carnage on the fields at Shiloh and would need to reevaluate the way they fought the war. The 7 Days battles were part of the Union campaign to get to Richmond in 1862. George B. McClellan was appointed General-in-Chief of the Union Army after the Battle of Bull Run. He launched this attack in 1862. The Confederates moved the capital from Montgomery to Richmond in June 1861. George McClellan was a great motivator of men, but was very, very cautious. He always believed that he was outnumbered, despite always having superior manpower. Robert E. Lee was McClellan's opponent during the 7 Days battle, which were 6 battles that took place around Richmond. Lee took over command of the Army of Northern Virginia earlier that month in 1862. Ultimately, McClellan was defeated as he refused to fully engage and would be relieved of his command by Lincoln for the first, but not the last time in his military career. With a string of victories under his belt, Lee now considered taking the war out of the South and into the North, which he would do in September 1862. Let's close the show by looking at advancements in technology and their impact on the war. Guns were much more effective during the Civil War. Rifles could be loaded faster, fired quicker, and were much more accurate than smoothbore muskets. If you look inside the cannon in the center, you see the grooves or rifling that spins the projectile, making it much more accurate. During the Civil War, a good shot could get off only 4 shots in a minute. I think this is why there is not a Call of Duty Bull Run. More accurate guns, with the aid of mini balls pictured on the right, and cannons will drive soldiers in the Civil War to start digging trenches to avoid the onslaught. We also see ironclad warships like the Monitor and Merrimack that would forever change naval warfare. These ironclad steamships would play a major role for the Union in many of their victories along southern rivers. We also see grenades during the Civil War. The Ketchum grenade was used by the Union. To work, it had to land on its nose in order to explode. If it did not land on the nose, they would fall harmlessly to the ground, and Southerners would throw them back. Southerners would also catch them in blankets and then throw them back at Union troops. Not terribly effective, but a step towards more deadly weapons of war. These advancements made the Civil War more deadly than the wars that came before it and changed the way that war was fought. This will be true of the wars that come after the Civil War, especially World War I. We'll finish the war next time, but until then, good night, Albuquerque.